Welcome to Native Calgarian, Oki, Naganago, Mekochi, Cheistokom Aki. Hi everybody, I have two cameras going here, one for putting up on our YouTube and one for going Facebook Live. So first of all, good morning. I'm just grateful to be alive. The reason why I'm going live today is that I was asked some questions yesterday from a grade 10 teacher, and so the students sent in about 11 questions, and I wanted to do the answers before I just do an essay that's 20 pages long. So I want to start off obviously by saying Oki, Naganago, Mekochis, Cheistokomaki. My name is Red Thunder Woman. My married English name is Michelle Robinson, and I use she and her pronouns. I want to acknowledge the lands of the Niitsitapi, which is the Blackfoot Confederacy. The Blackfoot south of the imposed U.S.-Canadian border are the Blackfeet, and north of the border are the Siksika, Gunai, and Bagani of the Confederacy. These lands are Treaty 7, signed September 22nd, 1877, with signatures that include the Blackfoot Confederacy, the Stoney Nakoda, composed of the Wesley, Chiniki, Bearspaw Nations, and the Dene from the Tsuut'ina Nation. I acknowledge all First Nation, Métis, Inuit, status, and non-status across Turtle Island as the keepers of these lands. All non-Indigenous are treaty partners, with government signing on your behalf. I honor the Blackfoot. I was born in Calgary, or in Blackfoot, Mohkinstsis, as Michelle Robinson, a very English name which has afforded me privilege in an English colonial world. My mother is Northern Slavey Dene, or Satu Dene, but my Indian Act Imposed status card by the Canadian government says Yellowknives Dene. My father is so Canadian that I am the daughter of the Mayflower and a daughter of the American Revolution, while having an Indian Act Imposed status card. I acknowledge my Dene lineage and that I was born in Calgary, but my family is not part of the Treaty 7 signatories. My Dene lineage roots me in the land of the Hare people, also called the Great Bear Lake people in Treaty 11. I am a native to Turtle Island, and my Dene nation is a visitor to this area called Clinchotine Indahe, which is a Satu Dene, meaning many horse town, named after the Calgary Stampede. Land acknowledgements are critical to creating a safer space for Indigenous, as well as honoring the host as a guest and acknowledging your role as a treaty partner. My humblest apologies to Blackfoot elders and language keepers as I try to learn proper pronunciation. Any mistakes or misinterpretations will be on me. I encourage questions so that misunderstandings can be cleared up as soon as possible, and I do not speak on behalf of all Indigenous. I just share what I know as I walk down my red road. So first of all, to the teacher in grade 10 that reached out to me, I want to say thank you for reaching out. The first question is, what kinds of scientific discoveries or inventions have come from Indigenous cultures in Canada? And what did they have in terms of science technology when contact happened? Well, thank you for the question. I want to start with explaining that Indigenous knowledge is now starting to be looked at through an Indigenous lens for the first time in Western history, because Indigenous knowledge has always been excluded up until now. I really love to encourage all to reframe this question by starting with an article with an Indigenous lens. So I'm going to be copying all of this into the videos so that way you get copies of these links if you're just watching for the first time. So this link is How Indigenous Knowledge Advances Modern Science and Technology by theconversations.com, and it's such a good article. We had a great relationship. We as Indigenous people had a great relationship with the water, land, animals, insects, birds, and all living things that has been forgotten by Canada. Yet the crisis of the day today is climate change, an issue Indigenous have been talking about for decades. Dr. Sheila Watt-Coultier has been an advocate for climate change for decades, and you can read about her work in the book, The Right to be Cold. The Inuit were seeing the effects of climate change, sounding the alarm, but ignored in many ways, even by Western science. And she's even presented at the UN. So I have a link to her book if you can't find it. Today, as we talk about climate change, many Indigenous leaders continue to remind Western leaders that this should be Indigenous-led in order to save the planet. In fact, the UN talks about the Sustainable Development Goals, and if we look at the UN Declaration of Rights of Indigenous People, you can see the parallels. But Western control is continuous colonialism instead of allowing Indigenous control of their lands, rights, and culture. Even Maclean's is starting to acknowledge that they need to reframe these questions. It's a realization that the Western world has a lot to learn from Indigenous knowledge. So Maclean's.ca has how Western science is finally catching up to Indigenous knowledge. Even in Australia, had the colonial government, or the Commonwealth, the Westminster system from Britain, had allowed the Indigenous to do their traditional ways, including fire burning, that could have reduced or prevented the major fires they experienced. Much of this exclusion we call systemic racism. Even National Geographic acknowledges it, and they have an article that came out that said, for decades our coverage was racist. To rise above the past, we must acknowledge it. And the BBC also covered that as well. Because Western science has excluded our knowledge, our community created OCAP, which these principles have 4 components: ownership, control, access, and possession. And you can learn more at the First Nation Information Governance Center.ca, and I'll include that in the videos. More resources on Indigenous science. I listed something from Indigenous Science Proven Practical and Timeless, and another link called We Rise Together. How long have Indigenous people been in Canada is the second question. Well, thank you for that question. The answer is to this depends. Canada is actually not that old. It's a new English imposed term to these lands for that's been thousands and thousands of years old. Indigenous origin stories state that we have always been here. There is evidence to it, but that also depends if you listen and validate Indigenous knowledge. And also, some people don't believe in the science of carbon dating. The very belief that Indigenous weren't always here is a way for settlers to try to give themselves permission for the recent land theft. Indigenous welcomed all newcomers, made treaties believing we would live equally. Western science and European settlers brought in theories that have always contradicted Indigenous knowledges of origin. An example of this would be the Inuit telling Canada or British explorers the fate of Sir Franklin's original voyage, and I have a National Post link that I'll be putting up with that. So if we listen to the origin stories of Indigenous, we need to understand that we have always been here since time immemorial, a phrase that you will hear many Indigenous use. Any questions, any questions that study, and I use study in quotes, Indigenous without the OCAP principles is questionable. So if you don't see OCAP principles already embedded, then these studies are from a Western lens without Indigenous knowledge. So I have a quote here. We know conclusively that humans were in the interior before that date, perhaps as early as 15,000 collaborated radiocarbon years before present. So it is highly unlikely they came south through the corridor. And there's a theory called the land bridge study, and this debunks it. I have another resource from nativecircle.com debunking it. I have another one from history.com that debunks it. And I think the most important part was that the so-called study that says that we came here through some type of bridge actually has many aspects of it that are in contradiction. So I have many different links to show that was disputed. A Japanese fellow, Dr. Emoto, talked about water consciousness. This concept upset Western scientists, and they worked on discrediting him. Here, we sing to the water, have ceremonies for water, fight for the water. Western economies and science is just understanding climate change, while Indigenous have always understood the balance of the natural world. Is it time to rethink how we approach other cultures and their knowledge? I think so. Number 3, what is the oldest culture in North America? Well, thank you for that question. As I hope I answered in the last question, it ties back, and Indigenous are the oldest culture here. Number 4, what impact did the 60 Scoop have on people? I hear a lot of kids are in foster care nowadays. Is it like the 60 Scoop? Thank you for the question. The 60 Scoop has never ended. The Truth and Reconciliation Commission has a whole volume on how social services or child welfare was created because of the Indian residential school failure in Canada. One of the major sections of the calls to action was the section on child welfare. Many of us do not want to believe that our parents or even ourselves have bias against Indigenous, but that bias has been passed on over and over every generation. Because European settlers, now Canadians, believe that Indigenous culture, language, and ways of knowing are inferior, we have years of imposed unequal policies on Indigenous. They give themselves permission to take Indigenous kids from families without proper support. If instead Indigenous were treated equally, we could heal this. I highly recommend reading the section on the Truth and Reconciliation Commission calls to action. For further research, I will also recommend the National Inquiry into Missing and Murdered Indigenous Women and Girls, as they also have child welfare policies as a contributing factor to the issues in the ongoing genocide. In my land acknowledgement, I say the expression that I always acknowledge all First Nation, Métis, Inuit, status, and non-status across Turtle Island as the keepers of these lands. Because I know that there are sometimes Indigenous in the crowd that don't know who they are in regards to what nation they come from, but they know that they're Indigenous. The 60 Scoop, which continues today, has taken that identity away. Without their ancestors, our land wouldn't have been taken care of. The clean water to drink. That's why sometimes if you talk to an Indigenous person, it can be a very hurtful conversation for them, just because, just as it would for a non-Indigenous who lost their parent, talking about a history they may not know because of the trauma of losing a link in their lineage. You may hear stories like, well, they were abandoned, but the truth is that story is likely originated by a government social worker or someone to help justify the bias of the 60 Scoop policy still in effect today. Someone who I look up to and follow is Dr. Cindy Blackstock. She has been working on issues of equality for First Nation children in care. She created something called Spirit Bear, and you can learn more about it in the links that I'll provide. Number 5, did colonizers give Indigenous people alcohol to get them addicted on purpose, or was it an accident? This is a really painful stereotype for Indigenous people, but I appreciate the bravery of asking a hard question. Yes, it was on purpose, as in the case of the signing of Treaty 7, but Indigenous and non-Indigenous have had addiction issues, also have trauma. Both Indigenous and non-Indigenous have something called intergenerational trauma that is now in their genes from both. An example of this for non-Indigenous would be the Jewish that survived the Holocaust, and I'll provide a link. There is a whole field of science called epigenetics that you can look deeper into the changes of DNA trauma that's created in all cultures. Addiction needs to be seen as a brain health issue that requires health care. Unless folks deal with that trauma, it cannot be healed. Today, I focus on programs through an organization called White Bison Society that came out of years of research through Western science with an Indigenous lens based around the medicine wheel. I run a program called Mending Broken Hearts, which openly talks about trauma and how to cope with it. Others on my team run a course called Wellbriety, an Indigenous created program talking about recovery from addiction, also called sobriety. Because so many non-Indigenous know nothing about Indigenous, that ignorance is a huge barrier for Indigenous to heal. That's why White Bison was created. So until Canada, Alberta Health, provincial, municipal leaders understand Indigenous, understand intergenerational trauma, respect Indigenous health issues, we will continue to see some Indigenous peoples coping with trauma given by poor government policies continue with addiction and sometimes even homelessness. Indigenous have been given different levels of government, many different solutions, But politicians and the people who elect them don't always understand addiction, solutions for addictions, and so we don't really get ahead on this. More resources I will have as links, but again, if they don't have the OCAP principles, then they're not seen through that Indigenous lens. So I have a couple here about the myth of alcoholism with the Indigenous, and one from the CBC, but one that I really like is from Chelsea Vowell, who is a strong Indigenous voice on issues and published a book. She has a really well-sourced article from 2012 I'll have in there. I have a ton of books on this subject, from Aboriginal Healing Foundation to the White Bison Society to individual authors, and I hope these resources above help you get started on understanding this topic better. Number 6, should the Indian Act be abolished, and why does it have an inaccurate word in it still? Thank you for the question. Canada has the Indian Act embedded in the Canadian Constitution. No politician likes to open the Constitution because it doesn't win elections. The Canadian public doesn't understand Indigenous, our issues, how the Indian Act is hurtful to Indigenous. So getting support is very hard from non-Indigenous. Many Indigenous are afraid that the 0.2% of land that we do have will be taken away. So even some Indigenous will fight against taking out the Indian Act because of the few rights we have from it. I would argue that is misplaced. All Indigenous have inherent rights and inherent rights to the land. UNDRIP protects those rights. We just don't have Canadian politicians that respect it. And I'll give you links to this in here. Today, the Canadian government is trying to create a new relationship with Indigenous and work on frameworks to have governance for the first time that respects the individual nation's governance structure. There are many issues with that today, and we can see that with the Wet'suwet'en in BC, who are opposed to a new pipeline being put through their territory. It is a clear example that the Canadian government doesn't respect Indigenous autonomy. Another would be the unequal funding distributed to Canadians compared to non-Indigenous, or compared to Indigenous, with Indigenous never receiving dollar-to-dollar funding. Not one of the other colonial Canadian political parties seem to want to listen either, because it's the NDP government in BC tag-teaming with the federal Liberals on this pipeline. The Conservatives have been so clear provincially and federally that they have no Indigenous understanding and do not have any intention of seeing Indigenous as equal partners. For an Indigenous organization that I support is the Yellowhead Institute, because it's First Nation led and completely nonpartisan. Also, firstpeopleslaw.com is a great organization for more from a legal aspect. The Royal Commission on Aboriginal Peoples, or RCAP, a lot of us say, they brought forward solutions forward in governance, but no politician was brave enough to implement the over 400 recommendations. There are solutions for politicians brave enough to listen. The truth is that the Indian Act and always will be a tool of oppression against Indigenous people to the benefit of the Canadian government. So when the Conservatives get back into power, I see zero reason why they will honor any agreements that are Indigenous-led governance. I think I have shown it's not a partisan issue, but all Canadian parties, all Canadian political parties, will not allow sovereign governance and the rights of Indigenous people. The Indian Act is a textbook case of imposing poverty and poor policy by the Canadian government onto the Indigenous people of so-called Canada. Number 7. What did Indigenous government and economies look like before the Europeans got here? Another great question, thank you. The Stoney were forced out of what is now called Banff National Park, and I'm going to read a quote to you. An uncomfortable truth about parks in Canada. Throughout Canadian history, efforts to create parks and protected areas have been rooted in colonialism. Throughout the course of Canadian history, governments created many of the country's parks and protected areas without Indigenous people's consent, sometimes forcibly displacing people from their territories. And I'm going to give you a link to ecojustice.ca that talks about Indigenous and protected and conserved areas, specifically for the Jumbo Valley. Anyway, prior to that time of being forced out, the Stoney territory was in Banff, and that area was a trading area. The Blackfoot would trade buffalo meat, buffalo skin, sage, and more with Kootenai, who had salmon, shells, and cedar. Trading has always been our economy. That's what it looked like before the Canadian Western imposed capitalist system. And I have some really great articles here from who is now an assistant professor, Darcy Lindberg, and he has this one about engaging in Indigenous laws. And that was done in April of 2016 that I have always went back in reference to. So I'm going to read a bit about it here. So Wetaskiwin and reconciliation. Oh, and I also apologize to any Cree speakers that if I mispronounce any Cree words here. Included in the calls to action by the Truth and Reconciliation Commission of Canada, the TRC, are significant obligations for the legal profession. The TRC calls for the recognition and implementation of Indigenous laws and legal traditions in all areas of work that we do as legal practitioners. Indigenous legal principles offer us a guide on how such reconciliation can be approached. Take the name place of the area where I grew up, Wetaskiwin, Alberta. A variation of the Cree word, Wetaskiwin, sorry, I'm just going to keep saying it. It translates into the place where peace is made, or the place where we live on the land together. A close variation of the word is a different Cree word, insert here, and that means the place where we become friends, which is a variation of Wetaskiwin. More than just the name, Wetaskiwin is living a Cree legal principle. This area is a place where Blackfoot people and Cree people came together and set out legal obligations on how to live on the land together. It is a place of treaty. Committing to look closely at the story of Wetaskiwin, there is much to learn about the disputive and resolution legal processes that still exist within Cree and Blackfoot legal orders. This simple act of looking is a small form of reconciliation that opens the imagination of how to further engage in this work. And I'll have a link that comes from Bartalk. And I have more resources specifically from Darcy Lindberg about ceremonial aesthetics and Cree, well, the Cree word for Cree, legal pedagogy, and I have a link from the U of Toronto.ca, and then I have another link from the U of Victoria Law, and this is a really cool study, or a really cool casebook that I want to print off. It's like 110 pages, but it's called Gender Inside Indigenous Law Casebook, and it has like a ton of stories. So this is that story of what it looked like prior to colonization and forced Western capitalism. So that you have a better understanding. Because the original question is, what did government and economies look like before Europeans got here? This is what it looked like. I'm going off script already. I better get back on script here because I'll just keep talking. So thank you for the questions. Number 8, what is the difference between a band council and a hereditary chief? Again, thank you for the question. A band council is a concept rooted out of the Indian Act imposed by the Canadian government. It recently was amended to make a band council with a false concept of voting. So the Canadian imposed elected band council has no real control. It is forced to be governed under the unequal and unfair legislation, which its goal was to never see Indigenous flourish, but to be controlled as wards of the state. Today, I am considered a ward of the state. The Indian Act has a small fraction of land allocated compared to the traditional lands of the people. I should also add that this is where they would separate and segregate a lot of nations. So if a nation was too big, they would cut them up in order to colonize them. Indigenous governance is thousands of years old. A hereditary chief is a person raised with principles of their people, their tradition, their laws, history, their traditional lands, which is way bigger than what the Indian Act allowed. And that's what the Canadian government, and that's why the Canadian government felt it had to outlaw the ceremonies and break the governance of Indigenous people to conform to European ways and control under the Indian Act. Many times the Canadian government claims it's got consent from the Band Council, but the truth is they can't actually say no. If they do, they lose funding, and they're backed with more imposed poverty for not agreeing with the Canadian government. I wish there was lots of media to give you to reference, but there isn't. It's not in the best interest of Canada for Canadians to know the truth through media. So a lot of the media you get is propaganda. I highly recommend listening to the Indigenous people. So in the case of the Wet'suwet'en, listen to them directly. So I'm going to have 3 links. I'm going to have one to the Wet'suwet'en crisis, Whose Rule of Law, that talks a bit about hereditary chiefs versus Indian Act band councils. And then I'm going to have a link to the Wet'suwet'en camp, the Unistoten camp, and then the Wet'suwet'en.com culture chiefs, so that you can get an idea that how researching that compared to what Canada will give you are so different. And I'm getting off script. Number 9, how did Indigenous people manage to maintain their cultures with everything that happened to them? Thank you for the question. Many nations did their culture and traditions in secret. A lot of their ceremonies went underground, knowingly breaking the law of the new imposed Canadian laws. Some cultures, or some aspects of their culture, were lost, but we are working really hard to learn our languages, traditions, and culture. Right now I'm speaking English to you. Wouldn't it be wonderful if one day I'm either speaking Blackfoot or Satu Dene, and that's recognized as an official language and you can speak it as well? Number 10, what are some of the biggest concerns that Indigenous activists are battling today? This is a hard question. For some, it's identity. So like back to the 60 Scoop. For some, it's learning language. For me, I'm speaking to you in English. For some, it's just surviving. Others have different things. The truth is, our existence is resistance. Every single day is a healing journey. And I want to elaborate on that by saying that the chances of me being here were actually very slim. But it's because of my ancestors that I'm here. So I honor them, and I honor all of the government policies that were imposed on them that somehow they still managed to survive. Today, in order for my daughter to be classified as a status native, I have to put together so many documents that will cost me hundreds of dollars, a problem none of my uncles or my male cousins will ever have. I'm lucky to be able to do that, but that's why I acknowledge non-status natives in my land acknowledgements, because obviously there will be a lot that cannot get hundreds of dollars of frickin' documents put together. I was non-status until after 1985. My daughter was born in 2007, and today, in 2020, our family is still facing these barriers. I can get her an Alberta health card, a SIN, a bank account, but getting her an Indian Act status number is expensive and hard. This was the intent of the Indian Act, to continue genocide and erasure of Indigenous people. These small rights of being classified were really hard fought for by other Indigenous women who I honor. To me, that racist legislation, the root of poison that poisons everything, until it's gone, we will continue to see systemic poverty, systemic trauma, inequality, and Indigenous being controlled instead of in charge of their lands, culture, language, and governance. But that doesn't mean I disagree with the other Indigenous who are working on degrees, PhDs, beading, teaching language, heading up the protests, running for office, living on the land, or the other things that they may be working on. It is a combined effort of tackling this with all sides. Today we struggle against Canadian bias in every aspect of so-called Canada. We don't get dollar-to-dollar funding. We don't get fair wages in the urban setting. We don't get fair and equal justice, education, healthcare, governance, land rights. We get followed in the stores. We have police called on us unjustly and killed as a result. Our kids are apprehended disproportionately. We are denied services, denied rentals, police wanting our IDs to card us, and more. Number 11. This is the last question for anybody watching. Who are some cool Indigenous women in history? Thank you again for that question. I don't want to leave you with the idea that Indigenous women are in the past. Today, I follow Christy Belcourt, Canagis Manuel, Pam Palmater, Ellen Gabriel, Jody Wilson-Rainbow, Lee Miracle, Buffy St. Marie, Dr. Cindy Blackstock, locally, Josie Nipanak, Charlotte Yellowhorn, Jackie Bromley, Cheryl Grey Eyes, lots of Two-Spirit folks, and more. Anyway, there's a really great book called This Place 150 Years Retold, and it's an easy-to-read graphic novel. And I'll give you a link in the description. The opening story is of Annie, a Métis woman in Red River that took a cocky new colonizer by the nose and whipped him publicly because he wrote a disgusting derogatory article in the Montreal newspaper about Métis women. And there are some days I wish I could do that today, especially with what I read in the paper. But anyway, thank you for asking me these questions. Remember that there are some great elders locally that have many teachings. Also in the Calgary Board of Education, there are finally some actual Indigenous liaisons that are actually Indigenous. They actually had this filled by non-Indigenous up until this point. Anyway, we advocated hard for that. And representation can be lost in a simple election. I don't want to name that one person, but one of the school trustees worked really hard for that, and I honor you for that. Because I don't know if she'd feel comfortable with me doing that. Make sure your candidates for elections understand Indigenous issues and are strong advocates for reconciliation. There are many resources from Indigenous authors, filmmakers, podcasts, writers, activists, musicians, artists, friendship centers, nations, powwows, and more. And I hope that you always feel free to reach out. I want to continue elaborating on all of this, but there are only so many hours in the day. And I just want to say, practice physical distancing, wash your hands and face, and be safe. Thank you again for having me.